It is time to begin our awards ceremony. And as we get into this part of our program, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Henry Fernandez, Chairman of the Foreign Policy Association.
Thank you, Pat. It is my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome and introduce Richard Clarida to all of you, members of the Foreign Policy Association. Richard will address the critically important subject of how the U.S. economy recovers from this terrible pandemic that we've been suffering. Richard is someone that does not need much of a lengthy introduction, but I would like to remind all of us of his outstanding achievements and excellent contributions. Throughout his career, Richard has been an outstanding public servant, a renowned academic scholar, and a successful global investor and economist. As a public servant, Richard is currently vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board for the last 2 years. He was Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy for the U.S. Treasury in President George W. Bush's administration. And he served on the Council of Economic Advisors under President Reagan. As an academic scholar, he was Professor of Economics and International Affairs for 30 years at Columbia University, with 4 years as chair of the Department of Economics. And as a member of the National Bureau of Economic Research, Richard served for 14 years as co-editor of its International Macroeconomics Annual. As a global investor and economist, Richard served for 12 years as Global Strategic Advisor with PIMCO, one of the largest fixed income asset management firms in the world. Richard entered his professional life well-trained in economics, having earned a PhD and a master's degree from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois. I would like to add that if you think that Richard, it's all about work and not fun, please think again. Because Richard is also known for making his own music. He released an album in 2016, and rumor has it that another one is planned to come out soon. Richard, it is my honor to present to you this medal on behalf of the Foreign Policy Association.
Well, it's my pleasure to meet virtually this evening with members and invited guests of the Foreign Policy Association. I'm truly honored to receive the Foreign Policy Association Medal. Past honorees have included Sheila Bair, Anne-Marie Slaughter, Paul Volcker, Jean-Claude Trichet, and of course my good friend and FOMC colleague John Williams. So with this award, I'm indeed in select company. Although I've been very much looking forward to receiving the award in person, that of course will not be possible tonight. But I greatly look forward to attending a future dinner to convey in person my genuine appreciation to members of the FPA for this special honor. Since mid-March, I, along with my FOMC colleagues, have been working from home. Indeed, just last week, we held our scheduled June meeting via secure teleconference. And while I certainly miss opportunities for face-to-face interaction along the corridors of the Eccles building, I am grateful to have the ability to work from home. And I want to convey my deep gratitude to all of those on the front lines of this crisis, those who are working outside the comfort of homes in grocery stores, essential services, and of course in hospitals and healthcare facilities. While the coronavirus pandemic has taken a tragic human toll measured in terms of lives lost and suffering inflicted The pandemic has also inflicted a heavy toll on the levels of activity and employment in the U.S. economy as a direct result of the necessary public health policies put in place to mitigate and control the spread of the virus. Real GDP declined at a 5% annual rate in the first quarter of the year and will almost surely continue to contract at an unprecedented pace in the second quarter. The unemployment rate, which reached a 50-year low of 3.5% in February, surged to 14.7% in April, an 80-year high. In May, of course, there was a notable rebound in employment and decline in unemployment, and these developments are welcome. Moreover, in recent weeks, some other indicators do suggest a stabilization or even a modest rebound in some segments of the economy. But activity in many parts of the country has yet to pick up, and GDP is falling deeply below its recent peak. And of course, despite the improvements seen in the May jobs report, the unemployment rate at 13.3% remains historically high. After the extreme turbulence witnessed in March, financial markets across many sectors have normalized and are again serving their essential role of intermediating flows of saving and investment among borrowers and lenders. Bank credit lines are providing liquidity to companies, and corporations with debt-rated investment grade and high yield are able to issue and in size in the corporate bond market. I believe, and most outside observers agree, that this easing of financial conditions since March is at least in part the direct consequence of economic policy responses to the crisis, including the actions the Federal Reserve took at our March 15th meeting and the subsequent announcement and sequential launch of 11 new facilities to support the flow of credit to households and companies. While this easing of financial conditions is of course welcome, to the extent that it supports the flow of credit to households and companies during this period, it may not prove to be durable, depending on the course that the coronavirus contagion takes and the duration of the recession that it causes. At a minimum, the easing of financial conditions is buying some time until the economy begins to recover. As I speak to you today, there is an extraordinary amount of uncertainty about both the depth and the duration of the economic downturn. Because the course of the economy will depend on the course of the virus and the public health policies put in place to contain it, there is an unusually wide range of scenarios for the evolution of the economy that could plausibly play out over the next several years. In my baseline view, while I do believe it will likely take some time for economic activity and the labor market to fully recover from the pandemic shock, I do project right now that the economy will resume growth starting in the third quarter of this year. In terms of inflation, my projection is for the COVID-19 contagion shock to be disinflationary, not inflationary. And the data we are seeing so far are consistent with this projection. For example, core CPI prices fell 0.4% in April, the largest monthly decrease since the beginning of this series in 1957. Although the decline in core CPI was smaller in May on a year-over-year basis, core CPI inflation is running at 1.2%, the slowest pace in 9 years. While the pandemic shock is disrupting both aggregate demand and supply, the net effects, I believe, will be for aggregate demand to decline relative to supply, both in the near term and over the medium term. If so, downward pressure on PCE inflation, which was already running somewhat below our 2% objective when the downturn began, will continue. Moreover, I judge that measures of longer-term inflation expectations were, when the downturn began, at the low end of a range that I consider consistent with our 2% inflation objective. And given the likely depth of this downturn, we are at risk of falling below that range. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate from the Congress to pursue policies that aim to achieve and sustain maximum employment and price stability. To me, price stability requires that inflation expectations remain well anchored at our 2% objective. and I will place a high priority on advocating for policies that will be directed at achieving not only maximum employment, but also well-anchored inflation expectations consistent with our 2% objective. At the Federal Reserve, we do take our dual mandate obligations of maximum employment and price stability very seriously. And since March 3rd, we've deployed our entire toolkit to provide critical support to the economy during this challenging time. In 2 unscheduled meetings, we voted on March 3rd and 15th to cut the target range for the federal funds rate by a total of 150 basis points to its current range of 0 to 25 basis points. In our FOMC statements, we have indicated that we expect to maintain the target range at this level until we are confident the economy has weathered recent events and is on track to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. On March 16th, we launched a program to purchase Treasury securities and agency mortgage-backed securities in whatever amounts are needed to support smooth market functioning, thereby fostering effective transmission of policy to broader financial conditions. To date, these purchases have totaled more than $2.3 trillion, and as we indicated at our June meeting, they will continue in coming months at least at the current pace, which should sustain smooth market functioning, thereby fostering effective transmission of monetary policy to broader financial conditions. Since March 17th, the Board of Governors has announced the establishment of no fewer than 11 new facilities to support the flow of credit to households and businesses. These programs are authorized under emergency lending powers granted to the Fed under Section 13(3) of the Federal Reserve Act and are available only in unusual and exigent circumstances, and with the consent of the Secretary of the Treasury. These facilities are supported with money invested by the Department of the Treasury, drawing on appropriations of more than $450 billion authorized by the Congress in the CARES Act for the specific purpose of investing in Fed programs to sustain the flow of credit to households, firms, and communities during the coronavirus pandemic. With these facilities, we are providing a bridge by stepping in and supporting lending throughout the economy until the recovery takes hold. These programs are designed to offer backstop sources of funding to the private sector, and just the announcement that these backstop facilities would soon be launched appears to have bolstered confidence in capital markets, allowing many companies to finance themselves privately even before the facilities were up and running. But importantly, these are, after all, emergency facilities, and someday, hopefully soon, the emergency will pass. When that day comes and we are confident the economy is solidly on the road to recovery, we will wind down these lending facilities at such time as we determine the circumstances that we confront are no longer unusual nor exigent. The Federal Reserve has played a leading role in the global economic policy response to the coronavirus pandemic. Foreign financial institutions borrow and lend in dollars, and these dollar funding markets seized up when the pandemic emerged. In integrated financial markets such as ours, these strains in dollar funding markets outside the U.S. affect the flow of credit to U.S. households and companies. As such, during the week of March 15th, the Federal Reserve coordinated with 5 foreign central banks to enhance its standing dollar liquidity swap lines. In addition, temporary swap lines were reestablished with the 9 central banks that had temporary agreements during the global financial crisis. Moreover, to support dollar liquidity to a broad range of countries, the Federal Reserve announced a new program on March 31st, the temporary FEMA repo facility. Under this facility, FEMA account holders at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York can enter into overnight repos with the Federal Reserve, temporarily exchanging U.S. securities in their accounts for U.S. dollars. These dollars can then be provided to institutions in their respective jurisdictions. All of these facilities have had a very constructive effect in calming dollar funding markets and supporting a return to more normal conditions in global financial markets more generally. Of course, as members of the Foreign Policy Association, you are well aware that developments in the U.S. economy do not happen in isolation from the rest of the world. We live in a globally integrated economy. With the pandemic, all countries have been hit by a global common shock, not only directly by the virus and the measures to contain it, but also by the economic spillovers from those actions around the world. As in the U.S., many foreign authorities have taken swift and forceful actions in response. My colleagues and I at the Fed have worked closely with others, bilaterally and in international forums like the G7, the G20, the BIS, and the OECD, to monitor and address the effects of the pandemic. The forcefulness and synchronized timing of actions by fiscal authorities, central banks, and regulators have helped support the incomes of households and firms and have reduced market stresses that could have amplified the shock. Now, not only is the Federal Reserve using its full range of tools to support the economy through this challenging time, our policies will also help ensure that the rebound in activity when it commences will be as robust as possible. That said, it is important to note that the Fed's authority grants us lending powers, not spending powers. The Fed is not authorized to grant money to particular beneficiaries to meet the payroll expenses of small business or to underwrite the unemployment benefits of displaced workers. Programs to support such worthy goals reside squarely within the domain of fiscal policy. The Fed can only make loans to solvent entities with the expectation the loans will be repaid. Direct fiscal support for the economy is thus also essential to sustain economic activity and complement what monetary policy cannot accomplish on its own. Direct fiscal support can make a critical difference not only in helping families and businesses stay afloat in a time of need, but also in sustaining the productive capacity of the economy as we emerge from this downturn. Fortunately, the fiscal policy response in the U.S. to the pandemic shock has been both robust and timely. In 4 pieces of legislation passed in just over 2 months, the Congress voted $2.9 trillion in coronavirus relief, about 14% of GDP. Depending on the course of the virus and the course of the economy, more support from both fiscal and monetary policy may be called for. In conclusion, the coronavirus pandemic poses the most serious threat to maximum employment and potentially also to price stability that the U.S. has faced in our lifetimes. There is much that policymakers and epidemiologists simply do not know right now about the potential course that the virus and thus the economy will take. But there is one thing that I am certain about. The Federal Reserve will continue to act forcefully, proactively, and aggressively as we deploy our toolkit, including our balance sheet, forward guidance, and lending facilities to provide critical support to the economy during this challenging time, and to do all we can to make sure that the recovery from this downturn, once it commences, is as robust as possible. Thank you again very much for this award, and I look forward to joining you soon in person. Thank you.
And our thanks to Dr. Clarida. We are here tonight to honor hospital workers. This spring was an extraordinary time at New York-Presbyterian. There really were heroes emerging in these past few months. So we pulled together some of the images of those heroes at work, a time that we will never forget. During some of New York's most trying times, as our city fell still, first responders and medical professionals stepped into the breach. They offered hope among desolation and despair, a last line of defense against a terrible foe. A grateful city thanks you for your service. A city stronger than ever, stronger together. we carry on New York strong. Strong in a time of great need in this city and a time of great need around the world. Our next two speakers in our program are Mrs. Daisy Soros, FPA Director, and Mr. Jerry Speyer, the Chairman of New York-Presbyterian. First to Mrs. Soros.
Thank you, Pat. It's so nice to see you again. You know, I'm a great fan of yours. And now, I feel so honored to have the opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Corwin, the Chief Executive Officer of New York-Presbyterian Hospital. I have known Steve for many years and count myself among the many admirers of his. Under Dr. Corwin's leadership, New York-Presbyterian has doubled in size and now employs more than 47,000 healthcare workers. New York-Presbyterian is one of the nation's largest, most comprehensive healthcare systems with over 200 primary and specialty care facilities. Dr. Corwin has established numerous life-saving projects during his tenure, such as the establishment of the New York-Presbyterian Regional Hospital Network and the New York-Presbyterian Medical Groups, as well as groundbreaking initiatives such as NYP On Demand. While expanding the reach of New York-Presbyterian world-class healthcare system, perhaps Dr. Corwin's greatest accomplishment is fostering a culture of putting patients first. It is a mission of New York-Presbyterian that regardless of a patient's background or economic means, they will be treated with empathy and compassion by the entire staff in the hospital. When COVID-19 came to the New York area, New York-Presbyterian's extraordinary team of doctors, researchers, and first responders were ready to meet the challenge. New York-Presbyterian more than doubled the number of ICU beds available. They worked with partners across the city to make personal protective equipment a priority. And they worked hand in hand with the state government to slow the spread and keep New York safe. Please join me in thanking Dr. Corwin and all of the healthcare workers in New York who risk their own health and sacrifice time with their own families to keep the rest of us healthy. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jerry Speyer, who would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Daisy. Steve, I'll tell you one thing. You're the only person that I would wet my hair for because it hasn't been cut in 3 months and put on a tie and jacket, even though they said casual, because I know you like ties and jackets. This has been a tough time for everybody. These last 3 months have been difficult. But tonight, this is a piece of cake. Talking about Steve Corwin is easy peasy, as the kids say. You know, back in January, when Noel called and he asked me to talk about Steve, I thought about it and I said, well, you know, I can do that, no problem. I know the guy pretty well. And then, you know, I started thinking, you know, Steve is really one of the best hospital leaders in the country, no two ways about that. Now tonight, I would say something very different. I'd modify that. I'd say that Steve Corwin is one of the best leaders in America, period, paragraph. Steve could do anything that he wants to do, whether it's running a hospital or a corporation. He is a magnificent person to watch in action. I love walking the halls of the hospital with Steve Corwin. Steve led the hospital and our city through some of the darkest days in the history of New York City. It's been really, really hard. Everything was in short supply, whether it was masks or gowns or ventilators or nasal swabs. Everything was just so hard and not within reach. But Steve Corwin met that challenge with creativity and determination that is rarely seen by an individual. Steve brought his staff along. The most wonderful thing to see is the culture that Steve has created at the hospital. Remember, there are 47,000 employees at that institution. And what Steve has done to create a sense of place and a sense of contribution to the community by the staff is absolutely miraculous. He has taken that group of people and made them feel in their hearts that this is their institution, their obligation to take care of the people that come to us for health care. You know, Steve's did something amazing. He took Columbia University's soccer field and created, with the help of a lot of people, an additional facility for our frontline workers to participate in bringing people back to health. You know, because of Steve, we supported the frontline staff at New York-Presbyterian. Because of Steve, the doctors never had to decide which patient was going to get safe, life-saving oxygen. Because of Steve, thousands of COVID patients actually left the hospital. Steve was the key man for our institution. Now, behind every key man is a key woman. In Steve's case, he's got Ellen, who is really, really very dedicated to her family and to the community. She's a wonderful person, and no doubt, she is definitely Steve's inspiration. You know, they're a great duo. They're really dynamic, and they've raised two great human beings, and even have one canine who is just a wonderful little dog. I think that Kathy and Joe represent the best in Ellen and Steve. There's no doubt that for the last 3 months, as Steve has run our hospital from this armchair in his living room, that he has definitely shown us how to lead, how to be strong under the worst of circumstances, and how to be sure that his people are right behind him. For me, I'm glad he's the CEO of New York-Presbyterian. In fact, I'm glad he's my friend. Steve, you have my utmost respect, all my admiration. And so I'm delighted you're being honored in this way.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for your remarks. Steve, it is my honor to present the FPA medal to you. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Daisy and Jerry, for your kind words. Those of you, of course, who know Daisy Soros and Jerry Speyer know that they're great citizens of New York, citizens of this country, and have had a remarkable tenure of support for New York-Presbyterian and Weill Cornell Medicine, and are terrific supporters of healthcare in general. So I want to thank you for your kind words, and thank you for this award. I also want to thank President and CEO of the FPA, Noel Lateef, and Chairman of the Board, Henry Fernandez, for giving me this award. It's a significant honor and something that I'm very pleased and honored to accept. You know, pandemics are one of the things that we have always worried about, and perhaps with Ebola, SARS, and MERS, maybe we got a little bit too complacent about the severity that a pandemic could wreak on an institution, and let alone an institution, a state, or a country. We first started to be concerned about this pandemic in January, when we started to see the reports coming out of Wuhan, and then got extremely concerned when we saw what was happening in northern Italy, and started to model at that point in time what in fact a pandemic could look like for New York City, and what it would take for New York-Presbyterian and all of its hospitals to respond. Our first case actually was on March 1st. It was in our hospital in Westchester, Lawrence Hospital. This was the 52-year-old lawyer who had absolutely no travel history, no risk factors for COVID. And after a couple of days of treating a presumptive pneumonia, we made the distinction that he had COVID-19. Once that happened, we knew we were in the midst of a pandemic for a very simple reason. This was clearly community spread. This was not somebody who had traveled either from Italy or from China. And once we knew we had community spread, we knew that the course of the pandemic was going to look very similar to Wuhan and to Italy. Unfortunately, in terms of things that we got wrong, certainly as a country, we got wrong the issue of how prepared we were for the pandemic, specifically in terms of tracing, contact tracing, and testing. And so as this pandemic unfolded, we were really hampered by the fact that we had inadequate testing capability. And certainly once a pandemic occurs, you're in a situation where contact tracing almost becomes moot. As the pandemic started to unfold, we started to realize that our supplies of personal protective equipment were going to run short, as well as the possibility that ventilators, the ability to ventilate somebody mechanically, was going to run short. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this, at the start of the crisis, pre-COVID, if you will, we were using 4,000 masks a day. In the midst of the crisis, we started to use 40,000 masks a day. At the peak of the crisis, we were using 100,000 masks a day. We had anticipated during a pandemic that we would double or triple the number of masks used, and that we should have a 4 to 5 week supply. Obviously, we were using 25 times the amount, and that was clearly going to catch us short. So we scrambled mightily to make sure that we had enough personal protective equipment, particularly the N95 masks. The fragility of the supply chain became quite obvious. Most of these masks were coming from China, and a secondary source of supply was Italy, and those strands were completely broken. U.S. manufacturing, as you know, was de minimis, and so we were relying on some U.S. manufacturing, redistribution from our manufacturers to New York, as well as trying to procure masks from China. So this was a particular concern in the beginning of the pandemic. As we got further along in the pandemic, it became obvious that we needed to double our ICU capacity. We had anticipated that we might have to increase our ICUs from 450 to about 600 beds. At the height of the pandemic, we were using close to 900 ICU beds. That required us to dramatically change the way that we staffed the ICUs. We developed a pyramidal structure. We redeployed 2,000 physicians and 1,000 nurses to support the effort. We created ICUs out of operating rooms. We created ICUs out of recovery areas. We were as innovative as one could possibly be in the course of this pandemic. And as you know, the mortality with this virus is quite high. 20% of people who were hospitalized died. 45% of the people on ventilators died. These were very sick patients. They just didn't require hospitalization. They required mechanical ventilation. They required dialysis. They required multiple intravenous pressors. They required mountains of sedation. And so the pharmaceutical supplies also were in question as this thing unfolded. We would not have gotten through this were it not for the heroism of 47,000 employees that showed up and made sure that they were caring for these patients on a day-after-day basis. Everything from chaplaincy to environmental service workers to the redeployed physicians and nurses to the administrative staff to people from finance that were redeployed to our supply chain. I could go on in terms of the level of will, indomitable spirit, and sacrifice that these employees made. At the peak of the crisis, over 3,700 of our employees had contracted the virus. Whether they got it in the community or whether they got it at work, we'll never know. But that also led us short of personnel. And we received personnel from all across the country, some that we hired, some that volunteered. Many of our academic counterparts, University of California, San Francisco, Cleveland Clinic, University of Arkansas, Mayo Clinic, Intermountain Health Systems provided us resources, people, the ability to do remote monitoring. When you talk about a country rising to a challenge, in my estimation, the red, white, and blue, if you will, of all the altruists around the country that we know really stood by New York and helped us through this crisis. We would not have gotten through this without the help of others. We certainly would not have gotten through this without the help of our board of trustees. We raised well over $40 million to support COVID efforts. We established food banks for our employees. We established 4 meals a day for our employees. We domiciled in hotels or in dormitories over 3,000 of our employees who did not want to return to their homes for fear of infecting a loved one. We had a bus service of over 50 buses that were transporting our employees so that they would not have to take mass transit. We supplied 4 meals a day to all of our employees. We also made significant attempts to bonus our employees during the course of this. When people run through walls for you, you want to run through walls for them. And this was the smallest amount of gratitude we could give to people who were literally putting their lives on the line. The stress of this was really extraordinary. I can't even begin to tell you the stress in our emergency departments and our ICUs. Imagine being a physician, a nurse, a caretaker in an ICU with a dying patient and having to connect that patient to a loved one via FaceTime and be the last person that dying patient touched. The level of extraordinary emotion, the level of extraordinary pathos, I can't even begin to describe. I'm sure you're aware that one of our great physicians, one of our emergency department leaders, took her own life while at home in Charlottesville after leave from the hospital. I can only imagine the despondency caused by the fact that people coming into the emergency department were dying left and right. This was a horrific scene. It was truly an Armageddon type of situation. Without the help of all of our other hospital systems in New York, I'm not sure that the city could have gotten through this. It is a cautionary tale in my mind, a cautionary tale about making sure that this global world that we live in is connected in a way in terms of public health that perhaps we were dismissive of. Our supply chains need to be reevaluated. The way that we're detecting disease needs to be reevaluated. The WHO, for all its flaws, is an important organization. We, the American CDC, had representation on the WHO. We should have been more aware of the ability of this pandemic to have occurred and should have been, I think, more forthright in our response to it earlier. Hindsight is always 20/20, but we should not make that mistake again. Our public health in this country is a quilt work of local, state, city, and then national response with the CDC. That needs to be strengthened. Our strategic stockpile needs to be strengthened. We need to have some manufacturing of strategically important equipment onshored, not offshored. And this demonstrated that dramatically. Hospitals need to become more flexible. The buildings need to become more flexible. We have to have training of people who are not ordinarily in ICUs capable of going into ICUs. So training needs to change. Our physical structures need to change so that we can create ICUs quickly and that we can convert regular rooms into ICU rooms. Clearly, one of the things that we were able to do during this crisis was provide telehealth services. We've now crossed the Rubicon on that. Telehealth will become an important part of everything we do as we move forward. And as we move forward, we have to remember that flexibility is the key. The ability to anticipate is the key. The ability to make sure that we have adequate supplies, adequate stockpiles, and that we can anticipate worst case scenarios perhaps better than we did. I'm very proud of the way that we responded to this. I'm very heartened by the support we got nationally. At the end of the day, it is the people, it is the culture. We should be very proud of our healthcare workers. I know that you are. I know that I am. In 40 years in medicine, I've never seen something quite like this and quite as severe. And our great workforce really came through. A workforce that's highly diverse, a workforce that comes from all parts of the world, that functioned as a single team for the betterment of patients. We did lose a lot of lives, but we saved a lot of lives. And I think in the process of that, we saved New York City, not just New York-Presbyterian, but all the hospitals. And I'm very proud of that. So thank you very much for the award. It's very meaningful to me. And I know it's going to be very meaningful, more importantly, for everybody who works for New York-Presbyterian. Thank you. There were a number of questions that were posed, and I want to start by saying that I will lump some of those questions together to perhaps give you a flavor for how we move forward from this. A lot of questions really focused on therapy and vaccine. The shortest time in the history of vaccines that a vaccine was made was the mumps vaccine, which took about 4 years from inception to actually being applied in patients. This warp speed development of vaccine, I think, is a welcome event. But we have to be very cautious about when a vaccine will be available for widespread use. First, we probably will start going into phase 3 trials during the summer. There are 3 or 4 different promising vaccine platforms. And these phase 3 trials will determine whether there's efficacy, whether there's enough of an antibody response to help prevent infection. And then, of course, you have to do the trials in human beings to determine whether or not those who got the vaccine actually had an infection rate that was less. So I would imagine that we will not have a vaccine in widespread usage for at least another 15 months and perhaps longer. There also has to be some recognition that certain types of vaccines in the past have created exactly the wrong response, a hyperimmune response. And one of the things we have to be very aware of with this particular disease is this cytokine storm, or the hyperimmune response, has led to the deaths. We need to make sure that the vaccine doesn't help promote that. So still a lot of questions around the vaccine and its development. In terms of therapies, we learned a lot with HIV, AIDS. It will probably be some form of combination of therapies, perhaps some of these antibody therapies in combination with antivirals. We're beginning those trials now. I don't think there's a silver bullet right now, but there are a lot of promising developments in terms of antibody treatment. There are promising developments in terms of breaking this hyperimmune response or the cytokine storm. So we'll see that unfold over the next 6 to 9 months. Hopefully, at some point in 2021, certainly not for the rest of this year, we will have something where we can actually say that we can provide either better treatment or a vaccine that seems to work. A lot of questions about, have we seen the worst of this in New York City? Will there be a second wave? We have not cured the virus. We have not developed a vaccine for the virus, as I've just said. Inevitably, as one opens up and you increase the number of social contacts that people have, you will have more infections. Hopefully, with social distancing, with an infection rate, an R0 of less than 1, we can handle it. Hopefully, the infections will be less severe, but we do anticipate there will be a second wave. Certainly, a concern right now is whether the protests will yield a second wave. It's too early to tell. We will probably start to see that over the next few weeks, if in fact there is. But inevitably, with reopening, there will be some second wave. You've seen in the states that have opened more significantly than New York, a significant uptick in cases in Arizona, in the Houston area, in certain areas of Texas, in Florida. So I'm hopeful that lessons learned from New York were being applied there, that we don't go so quickly that we create another calamity in another part of the country. The question of have we seen the worst of COVID in the United States is related to that. I think the answer to that is clearly no. There are 21 states where COVID is still on the increase. And it's not just that we're increasing testing. You can take a look at the increase in testing. You can take a look at deaths. You can take a look at hospitalizations. Obviously, a lot of the theory right now is that the viral load becomes critical in terms of how severely ill one gets. So if you catch COVID from somebody else, that may be different than catching COVID when there's a large crowd, and the viral load may be more significant. I don't think we've seen the worst of it. And certainly the economics of this start to become, as we've seen, a very severe recession here in the United States, some jobs that will be permanently lost, whole industries that have been upended. Certainly from the hospital standpoint, we will spend a lot more time working from home for a lot of our back office functions. Every other business is going through similar things. We'll change the way that our waiting rooms look. We've changed the way that our cafeterias would look. So until this is really under control, you're talking about a much different U.S. and a much different looking economy in terms of those parts of the economy that will succeed and those parts of the economy that will suffer tremendously until there's more in the way of therapeutics. Travel and entertainment clearly comes to mind for that. And then finally, the question about things like supply chain and something that the Foreign Policy Association is well familiar with, which is geopolitics. Our relationship with China is being called into question in any one of a number of different ways. And certainly, there's no question that this issue around supply chain, the issue around pharmaceutical supplies, the issue around things as mundane as heparin and other things, we have to call into question the fragility of that supply chain. And part of this is related to the geopolitical context, and part of this is just related to the fragility of supply chain, no matter how good the geopolitics align. But what I would say is that we do live in a global world. We live in a world where the pandemic, a viral pandemic, doesn't know zip codes, doesn't know red or blue states, doesn't know country borders. We've seen that. And we need to cooperate as a world. Otherwise, these calamities will become even more severe than this particular one has been. So again, I want to thank you all. I want to thank you for the questions that you've asked. I want to thank you for the kindness of bestowing upon New York-Presbyterian and myself this prestigious award. Thank you.
That concludes the formal part of the dinner. You are welcome to continue your conversations at your individual tables. I will admit that it has been more difficult in this format to eavesdrop at what's going on the next table, but we're also appreciative that you were able to make this happen, that you wanted to make this happen, to continue an annual tradition in this unconventional way. I hope to see you all face to face very soon. Thanks again for being here on behalf of the FPA.
Thank you, Pat Kiernan, for coming through for us for so many of our important events at FPA. And thank you for all you do for New York City as the iconic anchor of New York One. Before we resume socializing at our tables, I want to acknowledge that this virtual event would not have been possible without the extraordinary team that we have assembled at FPA. We've been together for over a quarter of a century, during which time we have weathered 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis, events that have had significant impact on the great metropolis, New York, that has been home to FPA for over a century. And now we find ourselves at the epicenter of a global health crisis. To my colleagues, I am grateful in this time of uncertainty and disruption for your extraordinary dedication to our mission. You have brought your best selves each and every day to confront the challenges we face. I'm inspired by the way you've pulled together, supported, and shown real concern for one another as we've adapted to the difficult transitions that none of us could have foreseen just a short time ago. I am grateful to our board of directors who have demonstrated in countless ways their commitment to our enduring mission. I'm in awe of our chairman, Henry Fernandez, and of our vice chairman, Sana Sabag, for having our back at every turn. To our members and supporters, you have my eternal gratitude. Thank you for participating in FPA's first virtual annual dinner. Physically distant, but virtually close-knit, the FPA family has found ways to tap into technology to create a new and unprecedented experience. Let me congratulate the recipients of the FPA Medal, Dr. Richard Clarida and Dr. Stephen Corwin, two leaders at the forefront of the response to COVID-19. I was deeply moved by the video that was shown earlier, depicting the healthcare workers who have made all the difference for each and every New Yorker. I want to thank Dr. Corwin and his team of 47,000 healthcare workers for their epic dedication. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the 12-hour days that Jerry Speyer, the extraordinary chairman of the board of New York-Presbyterian, put in for months, backstopping Steve and his team. As you've seen in your dinner journals, we have a wonderful turnout for this dinner, and I would like to acknowledge our underwriters, Frank Benak Jr. of Hearst, Henry Fernandez, Sana Sabag, and Jerry Speyer. Our co-chairs, Jackie Mars and Daisy Soros. Our dinner committee, comprised of Mike Burke, Jeffrey Greenberg, John Hoffmeister, Wim Quaker, Kay Maxwell, Doug Paul, Peter Scaturo, Keith Stock, Daniel Sullivan, and Enzo Viscusi. Again, thank you all for being with us. Have a great evening, and I hope that we'll see you real soon in person.